How did a king manage to win an entire war without lifting a single sword? This is the question almost no one asks, but it reveals one of the most surprising, unbelievable, and utterly absurd true stories that has ever happened in the history of the world. A real war, a true historical event, an episode so improbable it seems like pure fiction. Because when we talk about kings, empires, and battles, we think of blood, armies, epic clashes, military strategies, and violent confrontations. But not here. Here, you are about to discover the moment when reality was stranger than any movie, when a king became a legend, not because of the strength of his army, but because of something far more powerful: intelligence, strategy, and a courage that didn't depend on weapons. Imagine this: a stronger enemy, a larger army, a real threat about to destroy an entire kingdom. A situation that seemed impossible to overcome, a conflict that everyone believed would end in massacre. It was the kind of war that no one believed could be avoided. But while the generals awaited orders to fight, while the people prepared for the worst, while everyone feared what was to come, this king made a decision so unexpected, so illogical, so radical, that even today historians try to understand how it was possible. He chose not to fight. And that's exactly why this story became one of the most intriguing historical curiosities, one of most unbelievable real events, one of surprising facts that changed the destiny of a country, because this war, this real war, was not won by the blade, but by the mind. It was not decided on the battlefield, but in the shadows of diplomacy, behind the scenes of politics, in the details of a strategy so clever that it completely baffled its enemies. And think about it, in a world where kings were judged by how many enemies they defeated, how did someone manage to defeat an entire army without attacking, without retreating, and without shedding a drop of blood? How did a monarch, surrounded, pressured, and threatened, manage to transform what seemed to be the end into such an absolute victory that it became legend? What did he know that no one else knew? What did he do that no one else dared to do? And above all, how did this story remain so forgotten, despite being one of the most impressive ever recorded? Because what happened next was so improbable, so surprising, and so outside the norms of the time that it seems almost made up. But it's not. It happened, for real. And when you understand this king's secret plan, the detail that changed everything, you'll realize why this war without swords became one of the most talked about episodes among strategists, historians, and lovers of true stories that seem like fiction. And it all begins when the enemy finally advances. But before we continue this absurd story, this real twist that completely changed the course of the war, I want to know one thing from you. What would you do in that king's place? Would you have tried to fight? Would you have run away? Or would you have risked everything on a strategy that no one would believe? Comment below which decision you would make. Because understanding this story isn't just about watching. It's about participating, thinking together, reflecting on how a simple choice can change the fate of an entire empire. And since you're here, caught up in this narrative that's as surreal as it is true, take advantage of it and leave your like, because it shows that you really enjoy this type of content, these unbelievable true stories, these impossible strategies, these historical events that seem like fiction but really happened. Every like helps this video reach more people who, like you, love discovering the hidden, surprising, and unpredictable side of history. It is clear. Subscribe to the channel. Here we bring you exactly this kind of content: impressive historical facts, real wars, forgotten secrets, curiosities that changed the world, improbable events, and stories so absurd that no one would believe them if they weren't real. When you subscribe, you guarantee that you won't miss any of the next chapters of these epic narratives. Because believe me, there are many even crazier stories coming soon. So comment, like, and subscribe, because that shows YouTube that you want to keep diving into this universe where reality is stranger than any fiction. And now, with that said, let's go back to the exact point where everything changes, because it's when the enemy army finally takes the first step that this king's secret strategy begins to reveal its true power. When the enemy finally advanced, the entire kingdom felt the ground tremble. It was impossible to ignore the approaching threat, because this was no small army or ordinary territorial dispute. No. On the other side came one of the most feared empires of the time, led by a commander known for destroying entire cities just to make clear what happened to those who dared to oppose him. This enemy's fame was so great that many called his advance the inevitable end. And the most frightening thing, he didn't come alone. He brought an overwhelming force, experienced soldiers, endless resources, and a reputation for never retreating. It was as if the war had already been decided before it even began. Within the kingdom, tension grew like a shadow. People whispered in the markets, fearing for the future. Soldiers gazed at the horizon, wondering how many days remained until the confrontation. Advisors pressured the king, saying that any attempt at dialogue would be interpreted as weakness. And yet, however much everyone tried to avoid war, the general feeling was that it was already written in destiny. It seemed impossible to escape the approaching destruction. After all, how could a smaller kingdom with fewer resources face such a gigantic enemy? How could it confront a force that had already swallowed larger, richer, and better prepared kingdoms? Every day, new reports emerged about the brutality of the enemy army. Cities around them were falling one after another, like dominoes pushed by an invisible hand. It was a sequence of shocking real events, historical events that seemed so absurd they were fiction. And when the news reached the ears of the population, the sense of inevitability only increased. It was like watching a storm forming on the horizon, knowing that it would reach the kingdom sooner or later. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And here's the most intriguing part. The king knew this. He knew that a direct confrontation would be suicide. He knew his army wasn't large enough, that his walls wouldn't hold for long, that his generals were more frightened than confident. Yet he remained calm. He observed everything with a steady gaze, as if he saw something no one else could. While his advisors talked about preparing the defenses, he silently analyzed every detail, as if waiting for the exact moment to reveal a plan that didn't yet exist, or perhaps it did, but only in his mind. What made it all even more absurd was the speed at which the enemy advanced. They were so confident of victory that they were already sending messengers to demand early surrender. It was humiliating. It was a cruel reminder that, for this giant empire, the king's kingdom was just another conquest, another line to be added to the war records. And while this was happening, the people began to lose hope. Many wondered if the king really had control of the situation, or if he was just prolonging the inevitable. The war seemed so certain, so guaranteed, so impossible to avoid, that even the most optimistic felt the weight of defeat before it even arrived. That's why this story is so fascinating, because it's precisely at this moment, when all seems lost, when the enemy is stronger than ever, when war seems inevitable and the end seems written, that the impossible begins to take shape. It is here, exactly here, at this point where the kingdom fears being crushed, that the king prepares to make the decision that will change everything. And before I continue, tell me in the comments, do you think he should have fought, surrendered, or tried a completely unexpected strategy? Also say whether you believe that intelligence can overcome brute force in a real war. Comment below. I would have fought. I would try to deceive the enemy, or I would surrender. I want to see what you would do in this impossible. situation. It was precisely when the kingdom was on the verge of despair, when everyone expected to see the king finally order his troops to march or his walls to be reinforced, that he did something no one could understand. A decision so strange, so devoid of any military logic, that his own generals fell into absolute silence upon hearing his words. While the enemy advanced with all their might, while war seemed inevitable, the king simply announced that I wouldn't fight. No sword would be raised, no arrow would be fired, no troops would be sent to meet the enemy army. A total refusal, almost offensive, almost absurd. It was as if he had given up on the war before it even began. But the truth is, he hadn't given up on anything. On the contrary, his strategy was now beginning. A mysterious, calculated plan, hidden behind a silence that frightened even his allies. The king ordered the city gates to remain closed, but not in a traditional defensive position. He ordered that no soldiers position themselves on the walls. No rows, shields, spears, battle formations, nothing. The walls, which for centuries had been a symbol of the kingdom's strength, now seemed completely unprotected. It was like giving the enemy an invitation to enter, and this terrified everyone. The population didn't understand. The generals didn't understand. The advisors tried to persuade him to change his mind, to at least prepare the army. But he remained firm, observing everything with a tranquility that seemed almost supernatural. News of this decision spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Many believed the king had lost his mind. Others thought it was some kind of secret agreement with the enemy, a real event so improbable it seemed like fiction. But in truth, it was something even more surprising. The king knew that if he tried to confront the enemy with weapons, he would be destroyed. If he tried to hide, he would be surrounded. If he tried to negotiate, as everyone expected, he would be humiliated. So he did what no one would ever do. He took from the enemy what he most needed to win: resistance. And there was nothing more disconcerting for a violent and powerful army than to march towards a battle and discover that there was no battle at all. But the plan didn't end there. The king secretly ordered all trade routes to be abruptly suspended. He decreed that caravans be redirected, that messengers carry carefully manipulated information, and that small, nearby villages adopt unusual behavior, as if the kingdom were on the verge of internal collapse. It was a gigantic, extremely well-calculated charade, creating the impression that something very wrong was happening within the walls, something that could be a trap, a plague, a strategic vacuum impossible to decipher. This misinformation began to spread rapidly, carried by travelers, merchants, and spies, until it reached the ears of the enemy. And when the enemy commander received these reports, his reaction was not what was expected. He did not celebrate the kingdom's supposed weakness. He did not simply advance. He hesitated, because every real war, every brutal historical event, depends not only on strength, but on psychological control. And suddenly the enemy lost that control. The king had sown doubt where there had previously been certainty, and doubt in war is as deadly as any sword. Now, before we move on to the moment when the enemy finally tries to decipher this impossible strategy, comment below. Would you have believed that the king was planning something? Or would you have thought he was making the biggest mistake in history? Also comment on the phrase, "That doesn't make sense. Why did he do that?" Just so I know you've been following the story so far and are ready for the next twist. When the first enemy scouts approached the walls and realized there were no soldiers lined up, no archers positioned, no war flags raised, their reaction was not one of joy, but of bewilderment. It didn't look like a city about to be defended. It looked like an abandoned place or preparing a trick. They retreated, returned to their commander, and reported the surreal scene: a besieged kingdom, a threatened capital, but no visible military movement. For a general accustomed to direct confrontations, to resistance, to bloodshed, this was simply disturbing. And the more he tried to understand, the more irritated and suspicious he became. A real war was underway, but from the inside it seemed that no one wanted to fight. The enemy's immediate reaction was what any proud army would have, to advance even further. They brought catapults, erected enormous tents, planted banners around the city, as if marking territory even before winning. The sound of drums echoed day and night in an attempt to intimidate the people, to remind everyone that this was a real siege, a brutal historical event, not a bluff. Letters were sent to the gates, demanding surrender. Messengers shouted insults, calling the king a coward, a traitor, a madman, and yet, from above, the walls remained silent. No aggressive response, no shots fired, no sign of a counterattack. It was a constant provocation, and the king's silence seemed, in the eyes of many, a clear sign of weakness. Inside the city, the atmosphere was the opposite of the calm the enemy perceived from the outside. The people, seeing the sea of tents, the metallic glint of weapons, and the war machines being assembled, panicked. Families locked themselves in their homes. Merchants debated whether they should hide their goods. Mothers clutched their children as if the end were knocking at the door. With each new day of the siege, conversations in taverns, in well queues, in markets revolved around the same question: why isn't the king doing anything? In a world of real wars, where the normal response would be to resist, fight or flee, seeing a monarch simply not reacting seemed insane. The generals were furious. They had trained their entire lives for this moment. They knew how to assemble formations. They knew how to use the terrain. They knew how to transform even a smaller army into a deadly force if they used the right strategy. For them, the enemy was offering the perfect chance for an honorable defense, a battle that would bring glory even in case of defeat. But every time they pressed the king, they received the same cold, direct order: no one will attack, no one will leave, no one will raise a sword. It was as if he were taking away the meaning of their very existence, and that, for men accustomed to resolving everything with steel, was almost a personal insult. As the days passed, the tension became almost unbearable. The city was surrounded, trade was at a standstill, and supplies were being carefully rationed. With each new move by the enemy, the feeling that the king was ruining his own kingdom grew stronger. Advisors began to form small opposition groups, whispering about the possibility of removing him from the throne before it was too late. Some spoke of opening the gates, negotiating directly with the enemy general, surrendering part of the territory in exchange for survival. Gradually, a silent idea began to spread. Perhaps this time it would not be the enemy who would destroy the kingdom, but the king himself with his absurd strategy. Outside, however, the situation was far from perfect. The enemy army, so confident at the beginning, began to feel the weight of keeping thousands of men standing before a city that did not react. They expected a quick battle, an intense confrontation, a rewarding plunder. Instead, they found waiting, boredom, and an uncomfortable silence. The routes that should have provided supplies began to present problems. Caravans disappeared. Some nearby villages seemed too empty, others too hostile. Information was confused, as if someone were manipulating the flow of news and resources, and that someone, of course, was the king himself. Remember those strange orders given in secret? The cancellation of trade routes, the concentration of food within the walls, the organized movement of the people to strategic points? All of this was part of a silent strategy. The king had transformed the battlefield. Instead of fighting with swords, he fought with hunger, fatigue, doubt, and time. While his own people had enough supplies to endure longer than it seemed, the enemy, accustomed to living off local resources, began to face a simple and deadly problem: scarcity. Little by little, a giant, powerful, feared army began to be corroded from within, and this attrition began with almost invisible details. First, there were small delays in the arrival of food. Then, reports of sick soldiers. Next, discussions among officers about which strategy to follow. Insist on the siege, retreat a little, attempt a direct attack even without reaction from the other side. Some believed that this lack of defense was a classic war trap, a royal strategy too advanced to be ignored. Others thought it was pure weakness and that hesitating was a waste of time. This division of opinions was exactly what the king wanted. Confusion in the enemy command, doubt in the mind of those who should be decisive. Inside the city, however, no one saw this side of the war. What the people felt was the weight of the passing days, the sound of drums outside, the fear of a surprise attack. Prayers increased, as did internal conflicts. Some began to openly blame the king for the rumors of food shortages that were gradually emerging. Even with controlled stocks, the mere idea of running out of provisions was like emotional poison. With each rumor, confidence diminished, until a group of more desperate nobles decided to confront the king directly, demanding that he explain the plan or leave the throne. This was one of the most delicate moments in all of history, because there, within the very throne room, the war ceased to be. Solely against the enemy, and became also against the fear of his own people. They accused him of playing with everyone's lives, of turning the kingdom into a stage for a mad experiment, of choosing to become a character in one of those absurd true stories instead of acting like a traditional leader, and he listened to it all in silence. When the avalanche of accusations ended, the king didn't shout. He didn't order anyone arrested. He simply showed data. Maps, information he had secretly gathered over the years. He showed the number of men the enemy needed to feed per day, how many supply routes had been cut, the exact distance to the nearest allied base in that giant empire. He didn't reveal the entire plan, but he made one thing clear. That wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Even so, many left that conversation without fully believing it. It was difficult to trust something that no one had yet seen working. Outside, the enemy army remained there, menacing, and each night the campfires illuminated the sky as if announcing an attack at any moment. Until, after weeks of siege, something began to change. Nothing explosive, nothing cinematic, but details that only those who observe carefully would notice. The campfires became less numerous. The sounds coming from the camp changed. Instead of songs of anticipated victory, arguments, isolated shouts, and nervous orders began to emerge. The rigid discipline that marked that army seemed to be dissolving little by little. Messengers began to travel more frequently between the camp and the interior of the enemy empire. Rumors began to secretly cross the siege. A distant border of that same empire was under attack. A rebellion had broken out in another region. Other peoples were taking advantage of the total focus on that siege to test the strength of the external defenses. In short, the giant was beginning to be attacked in other parts of its body while keeping its eyes fixed on that single city, and keeping thousands of men standing there, without advance, without plunder, without clear victory, began to seem less a demonstration of power and more a serious strategic error. The chaos, which had previously seemed concentrated within the city, began to spread outwards. Doctors from the enemy army began treating more and more cases of illnesses linked to poor nutrition and the precarious conditions of the camp. Morale plummeted, and the more it fell, the more the soldiers wondered why they were still there, besieging a king who wouldn't react, a war that wasn't happening, a victory that never came. The siege, which should have psychologically crushed the kingdom, began to turn against those who imposed it. And it is precisely at this point, when everything seems lost for the people and unbearable for the enemy, that something truly improbable begins to happen, something that completely transforms the course of this true story that seems like fiction. Before I move on to this crucial moment, tell me in the comments, if you were an inhabitant of this besieged kingdom, would you have trusted the king's silent plan, or would you have rebelled against it? Also, write the phrase, Chaos began to turn against the enemy. If you've made it this far and want to find out what happens when this impossible strategy finally shows its true effect, and then, just when the siege seemed endless, when the enemy was still trying to maintain a facade of strength and the people of the kingdom believed they were living their last days, something began to stir behind the scenes of the story. Those subtle changes in the enemy camp, fewer campfires, less noise, less discipline, were not merely signs of attrition. They were clear symptoms that the giant was beginning to crumble from within. And it was at that very moment that the king's true strategy began to reveal itself, almost as if he had patiently waited for the enemy to collapse to the perfect point. The enemy commander, finally realizing that the siege wasn't working as planned, decided to act more aggressively. He tried to advance with small units, only to discover that nearby villages had disappeared or were abandoned. He sent spies to investigate possible ambushes, but found absolutely nothing. And this total absence of resistance was what disconcerted him most, because in real wars, the enemy always reacts. Always. Even the weakest try something. But that king, no. He was fighting in a way that didn't seem like fighting. It was a silent, almost invisible war, conducted with details that seemed insignificant, but which gradually eroded the enemy's strength. The second turning point came when the commander finally received official reports from his own empire. Reports that could not be ignored. His borders were under attack. Rebellions were rising. Other kingdoms were mobilizing in the absence of the great army that, until then, had guaranteed the empire's absolute dominance. In other words, by focusing all its strength on a small kingdom that did not react, the empire had left enormous gaps at home, and now these gaps were opening like cracks in an ancient wall. Internal politics were crumbling, allies were withdrawing, and the central power was beginning to lose control. It was at that moment that the commander realized, with hatred, but also with a certain respect, that he had fallen into a psychological trap set by a king who never raised a sword. Because while the enemy spent resources, time, and morale trying to force a war that would never begin, the king used precisely that obsession against them. Silence was not weakness. It was provocation. It was calculation. Each day without battle was a day the enemy lost more than they gained. Each night of waiting wore down men, supplies, and confidence. And now, faced with news from afar, the commander finally understood. He could no longer maintain that siege, not without losing everything. The officers gathered for a tense discussion. Some wanted to attack immediately, believing it was better to die trying than to retreat without victory. Others insisted that retreat was the only sensible option, and meanwhile, inside the camp, morale continued to plummet like a house of cards. Disease spread, desertions increased. Even the most hardened veterans were beginning to realize that this wasn't a war. It was a dead end. The final decision was made almost by force. They would retreat, not out of cowardice, but simply because there was no longer any way to sustain that colossal strategic error. The commander ordered the tents to be hastily dismantled, the supplies to be gathered, and the troops to prepare for an immediate retreat. And all this happened without the king needing to move a single military unit. There was no battle, no confrontation, no bloodshed. The siege dissolved in the same way it began, silently. From atop the walls, as the first enemy units began to march back, the people of the kingdom didn't know what to think. Some thought it was just another trick, a preparation for a surprise attack. Others believed they were dreaming. How could such a powerful army simply walk away? But for the king, that scene was no surprise at all. It was merely the inevitable result of a plan he had calmly, patiently, and with an impeccable reading of the enemy's weaknesses, had constructed. The war ended there, without swords raised, without arrows launched, without battle cries. An outcome so improbable that, even today, it seems more like a fairy tale than a real event. but at the same time so brilliant that it became one of the greatest examples of how strategy, intelligence, and psychological control can defeat the most overwhelming brute force. Now I want to know from you, how would you have reacted to seeing the enemy leave without explanation? Also, comment on the phrase, "This completely changed the game," if you're ready for the next part of the story. When the last group of enemy soldiers disappeared over the horizon, taking with them flags once feared, the feeling within the kingdom was almost unreal. Many expected to hear explosions, screams, steel against steel, but none of that happened. There was no epic rescue, no last-minute heroism, only silence. A silence so profound that it seemed impossible that an entire war could have ended that way. People took to the streets hesitantly, as if fearing that it was all an illusion about to crumble. Some touched the walls with their hands, trying to understand how they remained intact after the most threatening siege of their lives. And little by little, fear turned into enchantment, because the truth became difficult to ignore. They had won. Defeated without bloodshed, defeated without battles, defeated without the brutality typical of the real wars that marked that period. And, as always happens with extraordinary historical events, stories began to circulate. Each person told their own story. Each group invented details. Each tavern added a dramatic touch to the narrative. Some said the king had supernatural powers. Others swore that ancient spirits protected the city. But, in essence, everyone knew the truth. That victory without a sword was the result of something far more impressive than magic. It was the result of intelligence, psychological strategy, and an impeccable understanding of human weaknesses. And this combination transformed the king, previously questioned and even criticized, into an almost mythical figure, not just a ruler, but a strategist capable of defeating an enemy feared throughout the region without even rising from his throne. The historical impact of that was gigantic. Neighboring kingdoms, which had previously looked down on the small kingdom, began to study it with respect. Distant leaders sent emissaries to try to understand how such a well-planned siege had crumbled without a confrontation. Experienced generals became obsessed with this surprising true story, trying to reproduce the same strategy in later conflicts. But they failed because they didn't understand the main point. The strength of that victory lay not only in the king's plan, but in the specific moment in history, in the political tensions of the enemy empire, in the internal attrition that he knew how to exploit without ever revealing that he knew how. And of course, this victory also profoundly transformed the kingdom itself. Those who had doubted the king now walked before him with bowed heads, and it wasn't out of fear, it was out of admiration. The people came to see him as someone who not only saved lives but also saved the future. Nearby cities, previously suspicious, began to seek alliances. The economy, which could have been destroyed by a long and bloody war, recovered rapidly. Artisans, merchants, and soldiers celebrated not the destruction of the enemy, but the preservation of their own home. And this kind of victory, which preserves lives instead of destroying them, is extremely rare in the pages of ancient wars. Over time, this story transcended borders. Chroniclers recorded the narrative as one of the most improbable episodes ever experienced. Philosophers used the case as an example that true strength often lies not in violence, but in the ability to see what others do not see. And even the enemy empire, wounded in its pride, shaken politically, and forced to reorganize its troops, eventually recognized that this failure was the result of its own arrogance. They had underestimated a king who seemed too small to pose a threat, and therefore they fell into the most dangerous trap of all, believing they were already winning before even fighting. The legacy of this king became so remarkable that, even centuries later, his story is still studied as an example of war without war, of advanced royal strategy, of a historical event so absurd it borders on fiction. And the more you analyze each detail, the more you realize how ingenious it all was. Because it wasn't just a matter of waiting for the enemy to leave. It was a manipulation of expectations, emotional engineering, a precise reading of foreign policy, a rare mastery of military psychology, a plan so subtle that, if any element had been out of place, it would have failed completely. That's why this story seems like fantasy, but it's not. It seems invented, but it wasn't. It's one of those moments where reality surpasses any script, any novel, any medieval legend. And, as incredible as it may seem, it all began with a king who dared to do the unthinkable, to fight without fighting. This war could have destroyed an empire, but it ended without a single duel. And the most surprising thing? It really happened. Now I want to know from you, what impressed you most about this seemingly impossible victory? Also comment on the phrase, "Strategy triumphed over the sword," to show that you've been following the story so far and want to see what happens next. If you've made it this far, it's because this story really captivated you. So don't let this opportunity pass you by. Subscribe to the channel now. Because here, every week you'll find real stories so impossible, so surprising, and so absurd that they seem like fiction, but they really happened. And do this, so I know who actually stayed until the end of this video. Comment below. I stayed until the end of the war. I want to see who the truly passionate fans of incredible historical events are. Oh, and if this video surprised you, leave a like, because this greatly helps in bringing more epic stories like this one. And now, don't go anywhere. Click on the next video that is appearing on the screen, because the next story is even more unbelievable than this one. You won't want to miss it.